I, Saquib Rahman, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Law, North-South University, would like to welcome you all to our webinar today. It is absolutely wonderful to have welcomed Professor Richard H. Steinberg this evening, who has very kindly made the time to talk on a very interesting topic, international law and policy in the Biden administration. Before we request Professor Richard to start, I would like to bring to the notice of the listeners that the chat box is open and that they may address any questions there in the box. The audience is requested to please keep their microphones and cameras off at all times. And lastly, I would extend my thanks on behalf of the Department of Law to all of you present here today. Now, regarding our guest speaker, Professor Richard is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, counselor to the American Society of International Law, a member of the United States Trade Representatives Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee, chair of the International Trade Law Committee of the American branch of the International Law Association, director of the Trade Policy Research at Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy at UC Berkeley, and editor-in-chief of the award-winning ICC Forum. It is notable that he served on the board of editors of the American Journal of International Law. Professor Richard has written numerous books and has over 50 articles on international law. He's currently teaching at the University of California, Los Angeles as a professor and is the Jonathan D. Varat Endowed Chair in Law. Now, before we listen to Professor Richard, I would like to request Professor Rizwanul Chair of the Department of Law at North-South University, for his introductory remarks. So.
Thank you, Saki. Good morning or good evening, dear audience, depending on wherever you may be. The US's role in international law and international affairs, as you know, is undoubtedly something that we all see, we all perceive, and we all feel. Since particularly, I guess, the end of the World War II, in playing a pivotal role in the creation of the United Nations, then in signing the GATT, and then also as one of the principal architects of the WTO. And not just in this forum, but in many other international forums, the US has a significant role. And the position that it takes has a significant impact on the international law and international policy making. Many in the US may or may not care about the rest of the world, as there is a joke that some in the US possibly do not count or do not worry too much about quote unquote the rest of the world. But for sure, I would imagine many in my country and beyond my country would look up to the US in so many ways that some scholars mockingly say that we feel that we should have a voting right in the US elections. That what happens there is not only important for the people of the US, but also for many of us who live beyond the US. If I have to give you a practical example, many of you might be aware that when the Trump administration blocked appointment in the WTO appellate body, subsequently the WTO appellate body is now not functioning. Some other WTO members, they have agreed on some sort of temporary arrangements, but the WTO that we knew to exist in, let's say, 2018 or early 2019, its dispute settlement process is not operating in the same way. And that is mainly because of the position that the former US administration took about the appellate body appointment process. So that perhaps tells us how much importance that the United States has on the dynamics of international law. And as a scholar and policymaker, I think our today's speaker is very well placed to comment on the possible directions that the new US administration may take and how that can have a role in shaping and reshaping international law and international institutions in the next 4 years or so. With that note, I look forward to the talk to be given by Professor Steinberg and also your questions. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, sir. Professor Richard, whenever you're comfortable.
Very good. Well, thank you, Professor Rizwan, for your thoughtful introductory comments and for the invitation and honor of speaking with your students and colleagues. And thank you, Mr. Sakib, for your kind introduction and for moderating today. I want to talk today about 5 foreign policy and international law tensions that are faced by the Biden administration. These are not new tensions, but the balance between them has varied over time. I will focus on ways in which that balance has shifted from the Trump administration, changes from the last administration, and from the period before the Trump years, for purposes of organizing the talk. I'm sharing a screen here that identifies these 5 tensions. The first tension being the extent to which the US focus will be international versus domestic, the tension between whether we will cooperate with other countries or confront them in this multipolar world, the question of whether our focus, the US policy and law focus, will be on multilateral law and policy or plurilateral law and policy, that is, law and policy that engages the entire world, multilateralism, or law and policy that focuses on working with like-minded countries. The fourth tension is between a foreign policy that focuses strictly on geostrategic matters of interest to the United States versus those that focus on moral issues, such as human rights, democracy, and the like. And then the fifth tension is the extent to which this administration will be able to advance a rules-based international order versus getting stuck in a slow trend towards delegalization, which I believe is already underway. So with that introduction, I also wish to note that in no way do I represent the Biden administration. These are my own personal views. So the first tension, the international focus versus a domestic focus. So by necessity, President Biden has made clear that several domestic political crises need to be resolved before we can undertake major new initiatives in international affairs. The COVID pandemic has, of course, by necessity, is the focus of this administration's policy. That means focusing not only on vaccination, restarting our schools, which have been closed for a year, on the high unemployment rate due to a collapse of the economy under COVID, building infrastructure in strategic sectors, and focusing on a civil rights matter that we have in the United States. That is a sense by many, particularly the African-American community, that there is prejudice against them. So his administration has stated that it will be focusing on these matters before turning to international matters. International matters aren't being ignored. It's just that major new initiatives are on the back burner. More subtly, perhaps, the domestic interests and political landscape of the United States has changed in the last 5 years. So the domestic pressures and constraints on US foreign policy, on traditional US foreign policies that have been the norm for decades, might be subtly different in 2 respects in particular. The first is with regard to trade policy. The United States for several decades now, for 2 or 3 decades, has pursued what I would describe as a hyper-liberal trade policy. That is almost a laissez-faire, wide open markets, let's open other markets, let's open our market further approach. Before that, there was a balance. There was a balance from 1947 until about the time of the creation of the WTO, till about 1995, between trade openness on one hand and social policies on the other that provided exceptions to free trade, things like environmental bases for trade measures, things like focusing on making sure that human health and animal health is protected. We called this balance embedded liberalism. The liberalism was embedded in a social contract or understanding about legitimate exceptions to free trade. So I think that we're moving back toward that from a period of sort of hyper-liberalism. And that, of course, affects our approach to trade relations broadly and to the WTO in particular. The second way I think that we are deviating subtly from policies of the last 20 years or so is with regard to immigration. The Biden administration's immigration policies will be far more humane than those in the Trump administration, and will allow for political asylum and take political asylum legitimately, which I don't think was the case in the Trump administration. However, we will not revert to the policy of roughly 2000 to 2015, which was practically wide open borders. The United States took in more immigrants than at any time in US history during that period. And it's created some social conflict within the United States. Now, the trade and the immigration issues are intimately related. Open markets, hyperliberalism, has meant that US unskilled and semi-skilled workers can't possibly compete with goods produced by unskilled and semi-skilled workers in the developing world. If an American worker who is unskilled is being paid $15 an hour, and there's labor all over the developing world willing to work for $1 an hour or less, clearly production that entails unskilled and semi-skilled work would leave the United States, and it did. And it's left tens of millions of Americans who don't have a college education, unemployed and unemployable, which is one reason that we're moving back towards this embedded liberalism, moving away from completely open, from open borders with regard to trade. For the same reason, I think, similar reasons are affecting the politics of immigration, in that immigrants who are unskilled or semi-skilled, who are trying to come to the United States, are seen as competition for the relatively few remaining jobs for unskilled and semi-skilled laborers who already live here. So those two are intimately related. So the point of on the issue of international versus domestic is that the international focus will be secondary in the next few years, with domestic health, economic, and social policy being the primary focus. The second tension is between the extent to which the United States will cooperate with other countries versus confront them in today's world. Cooperation has already increased markedly from the Trump years, but cooperation is harder than ever. So Biden certainly recognizes that attempts to cooperate with like-minded countries are needed. Trump, of course, famously picked fights with everyone, picked fights with our longtime allies, Germany, France, Canada, Mexico, and of course, picked fights with China as well. And then called developing countries an awful name. He picked a fight with everyone. Biden expressly intends to try to cooperate. And he's stated two very good reasons for cooperating. The first is that there are all sorts of global issues that can't be resolved without cooperation, such as stemming climate change, or engaging in arms control. We've already rejoined the World Health Organization. We have rejoined the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We are re-engaging with Iran on the nuclear arms control arrangement. And second, the US needs allies. Of course, we need allies to try to advance a rules-based international order that upholds the rules that Professor Rizwan alluded to, that the United States helped build. So we need to cooperate, and this administration intends to cooperate, and cooperate far more than the Trump administration did. However, there are serious barriers to cooperation. The first barrier is that we now live in a world that is very different from the world of 20 years ago, in that there are two very powerful revisionist states. China is the greatest threat to democracy, human rights, and a rules-based international order since the Second World War. Under Xi, China is an overtly revisionist and aggressive power. This has been demonstrated by its actions in Hong Kong, its saber rattling towards Taiwan, most markedly its policies in the South China Sea and East China Sea, its occupation in the last several weeks of islands that belong to the Philippines. And it's also enabling other countries to engage in behavior that violates the norms of the rules-based international order, whether that's North Korea's oppression of its citizens and North Korea's nuclear weapons policy, or enabling Myanmar's policy towards the Rohingya. So it is a clearly revisionist power, a challenge to the rules-based international order. It's also the biggest threat to human rights and democracy on the face of the planet, as exemplified by the Uyghur genocide, the fact that it is a surveillance totalitarian state with cameras everywhere that have facial recognition, a biometric recognition, and now a digital currency that will monitor the transactions of its citizens. It opposes international law that protects civil and political rights and offers no support for international criminal law. This makes cooperation with China difficult. It also makes cooperation with, similarly, cooperation with Russia is very difficult. Under Putin, Russia is also overtly revisionist, intervening in the Middle East, threatening to intervene in the Baltics, and it is clearly also an enemy of democracy and human rights, as exemplified by its interference in US and European elections, its support for Syria's Assad, the fact that it brazenly poisons political enemies abroad. Cooperation with these revisionist states will be extremely limited, perhaps on climate change, perhaps on arms control. Beyond that, it's difficult to see substantial cooperation with those revisionist states. The cooperation, however, therefore, will focus on cooperation with the status quo powers, natural allies, in particular the European Union and the Quad countries in Asia Pacific. Let me address each of those first, or serially. First, the European Union. So cooperation with the European Union is going to increase considerably from the Trump years, but it too will be limited. The European Union is focused inward like never before. It does not share, the European countries do not share the same interests in Asia that the United States has. The United States has been a de facto defender of Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, a de facto ally of India, and China challenges all of those de facto allies. And the European Union doesn't, the European states don't really have a car in that car race, right? So Germany, for example, is sort of more interested in fostering economic ties with China than getting in between the United States and China or taking one side or the other. That makes cooperation with Europe limited. Moreover, so cooperation with Europe with regard to Russia is easier to envision. Russia is a potential military threat to parts of Europe, particularly the Baltic states. But even there, because Donald Trump suggested a few times that we might withdraw from NATO, the Europeans have indicated that they may take a more independent approach to their defense against Russia. The Quad countries in Asia, what the interesting development, of course, from a US perspective in Asia is the emergence of what appears to be a nascent effort to balance against China, as exemplified by engagement between the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, and military exercises, naval exercises that are underway among those Quad countries that are clearly aimed at trying to contain China. So cooperation with these like-minded countries will take place. With Europe, it will be limited, though, and focused on Russia, and building up a serious alliance among the Quad countries will be at best a slow process, but I believe that is underway. In terms of cooperation with developing countries, we will continue to cooperate with developing countries, certainly more than in the Trump administration. But of course, developing countries are mostly interested in survival and staying neutral in the face of tensions between these great powers that I've referred to, which I would define as China, the United States, Russia, the European Union as a bloc, to some degree, Japan. So the Biden administration will try to cooperate, in short, with other countries far more than Trump, but the administration will find cooperation with most others will be harder than at any time since the Second World War. The third tension is whether the focus will be multilateral versus plurilateral. Again, as Professor Rizwan pointed out, the United States, of course, was one of the architects of the post-World War II rules-based international order that is global, a main architect of the United Nations, of the World Trade Organization and the GATT before it, of the International Monetary Fund, of the UN agencies. So it has had, certainly one would say from 1945 to the year 2000, the United States was focused multilaterally. I would say even through 2010 or 2015, perhaps even, it was multilaterally focused. I don't think that that's possible anymore. I think that the fundamental problem is that these revisionist powers, China and Russia, fundamentally disagree with the United States and Europe in particular on a host of issues. And they are now, China in particular, far more powerful than they were previously, making multilateral agreement on fundamental issues very, very difficult. Take, for example, in the World Trade Organization, a multilateral entity. Just take one issue, right? State-led cyber theft of trade secrets and intellectual property. The Chinese state leads a coordinated effort in cyber theft of intellectual property from the West, from the United States in particular, that astonishingly does not violate any international law. The TRIPS agreement in the WTO TRIPS agreement doesn't address state-led theft of intellectual property. No one thought, even remotely considered that a possibility when the TRIPS agreement was drafted. China will certainly not agree to a new rule on that. So to combat that, the WTO will not be an effective venue for combating that. So I believe that plurilateral and bilateral arrangements will be the focus of US foreign policy and international law building, building law among like-minded countries, not a multilateral focus. The fourth tension is between foreign policy that is morality-based and foreign policy that is geostrategically based. The US has been a champion, a global champion of civil and political rights, democracy, and humanitarianism for most of the last 75 years. There have been deviations, of course, but the US has tried to build a world order and support a world order in that vision. Donald Trump deviated more conspicuously than any other US president since World War II, deviated from that commitment, ignoring or trying to ignore things like Putin's interference in foreign elections, poisoning opposition figures, trying to ignore the Khashoggi killing by Saudi Arabia, ignoring Saudi atrocities in Yemen. Trump seemed to like autocrats more than Democrats. He fought with Macron in France, with Frau Merkel in Germany, but he referred to Putin as his good friend, to Shia as his good friend, Mohammed bin Salman as his good friend, even Kim Jong-un as his good friend. Biden is clearly moving back toward focusing on human rights and democracy, already having taken the following actions. He has arms to Saudi Arabia of the arms that were aimed at the Houthis. He has imposed harsh economic sanctions on Putin cronies for poisonings and election interference. He has imposed harsh economic sanctions on Chinese military and party leaders for the Uyghur genocide, imposed harsh economic sanctions on Myanmar military leaders for their coup and associated activities. He has rescinded Trump-era economic sanctions that had been imposed on the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. He is reviewing whether to declare Myanmar military's action against the Rohingya as a genocide. He's providing approximately $400 million US in humanitarian aid for the Rohingya refugees, most of that in Bangladesh. But despite that shift back towards concern with humanitarianism, democracy, and civil and political rights, there are geostrategic constraints and considerations on that shift. For example, the US needs Saudi Arabia to maintain the balance of power in the Persian Gulf against Iran. So the United States can't fully break with the crown prince there. Similarly, the US wants good relations with the Philippines, where we have a crucial naval base in the Western Pacific. Philippines obviously has a crucial geostrategic position with regard to China. So we can't overtly break from Duterte, who is a murderer, an enemy certainly an enemy of civil and political rights. Some of the US wants and supports a free and independent Taiwan, but does not want to get into a shooting war with China, obviously. And on the Russian front, the US opposes Russian aggression in places like Ukraine, its support for a murderous Assad in Syria. Together, Assad's actions has led to the brutal killing of tens of thousands of innocent civilians. But the US doesn't want to get into a shooting war with Russia either. So the US is increasing its emphasis back to democracy, human rights, and humanitarianism in foreign relations, but remains constrained by geostrategic interests. Finally, the fifth tension is on international rule of law versus delegalization. Strengthening international rule of law and a rules-based international order is again a guiding principle of US foreign relations. But deepening international law will be very difficult. And the US faces increasing pressure to either change certain areas of international law or to contravene it. So let me start with the idea of shifting back towards international rule of law. The Secretary of State appointed by, who is our foreign minister, appointed by Biden, is a career foreign policy diplomat. And that foreign policy establishment, which is quite a contrast, by the way, to the Trump secretaries of state, who were from the business community and really hadn't absorbed the norms of the foreign policy establishment. The US foreign policy establishment before the Trump administration and now back in the seat of power is a guardian of international law, and it will be again. Going back to this point that I've made and that Professor Rizwan made, that the US drafted, was largely responsible for drafting the founding charters of most international agreements in the post-war period. Again, the UN, the WTO, IMF, World Bank, World Health Organization, et cetera. Given that we were architects of that, it only makes sense for us to want to support that the rules-based order that we helped establish. So this is a clear shift from the US unilateralism, the unapologetic violations of international law in the Trump era, but reinvigorating the rules-based international order and complying with international law will be increasingly difficult for a few reasons. The first is that substance of much international law is dated and becoming more dated every day, and it's hard to reach new agreement due to the dispersion of global power and divergent interests of these revisionist and these status quo states. I gave one example of it being difficult to develop new rules in the WTO, new rules, banning state-led cyber theft of trade secrets, for example. But it is similarly just more difficult on several fronts. It's arms control, nuclear arms control is far more difficult now than it was in past years. If one looks back at nuclear arms control in the earlier era, right, it was between the United States and the Soviet Union, or between the United States and Russia. Now on tactical nuclear weapons, China has to be included in that conversation. Well, reaching an agreement between 3 powers versus 2 powers is far more difficult. And as just the more, in general, reaching agreement among a larger number of countries is more difficult than just between, say, a pair of countries. So in a world that is fundamentally multipolar, reaching agreement on new rules is extremely difficult. What we have emerging in international law are chasms in international law. And when you have those chasms, as technology marches forward, as new strategies for getting ahead in the world order emerge, those chasms become sources of friction. And it's very, very hard to fill them. Similarly, there's far more breach of international law today than there was, say, 20 years ago. For example, China's breaches of international law in the Western Pacific, its claims to South China Sea and East China Sea, Russia's actions in collaboration with Syria, Russia's actions in Ukraine, Iran's action seizing ships in the Persian Gulf. There is a lot of overt flouting of international law by competing powers. Now, of course, in international law, material breached by another party is a basis for withdrawal from international agreements. But of probably greater moment is that foreign international law breaking is not a good environment for seeking new rules. And to the domestic audience, it looks very naive to follow international law when other countries aren't playing by the rules. Finally, there is no consensus on how to interpret international law. So we have far more international courts today than we had 20 years ago or 30 years ago, about 30 international courts, which are tasked with the role of interpreting ambiguities in international law, filling gaps in international law. As those gaps are widening, these international courts have, face a bigger challenge than before. And if there were agreement among states on how to fill those chasms, they would do it by negotiation. But instead, it's being done to some degree by interpretation, by courts, and as I said, there's no agreement on how to interpret. And I mean this in a very fundamental jurisprudential way, right? So there are many countries, I would say the UK, the United States, for example, have a pretty fierce view of sovereignty. That if we haven't committed to a specific rule, then we shouldn't be, then an international court shouldn't interpret a gap or an ambiguity in a way that constrains a sovereign state. Whereas, for example, the European approach to interpretation is that the international court's role is to fill these voids, is to complete the contract. And this is the continental European approach. So there isn't even agreement on sort of the jurisprudential stance that international courts and judicial bodies should take. So the result, I think, put together is that the United States will abide by almost all international law almost all the time, but there will be increasing contravention of international law, not just by the United States, but by other countries. There will be fewer new international institutions, laws, or courts. And with regard to the WTO, also mentioned by Professor Rizwan, there will be great difficulty rebuilding the WTO. So in conclusion, compared to the Trump years, the last 4 years, the Biden administration is steering the US back into more traditional US stances, attempting cooperation with foreign countries, more respect for and but this will not be a return to the status quo ante. Each of those moves based international order. As power slowly disperses in the international system, we expect less international cooperation and shallower this means more instability. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much.
I was going to say the one reason I accept in the globe And so I'm looking forward to your questions.
Professor, thank you very much. We do have a lot of questions already. I hope you are being able to hear me. If you would permit, I would go with the first question, sir.
Please.
The first question. What do you think would be the Biden administration's response to the Regional Comprehensive Partnership Agreement, RCEP?
Okay, so that's a great question. I do think that the United States will respond somewhat defensively by making an overture to join the comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. The United States, of course, in the Obama administration, was one of the architects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Donald Trump declared all international agreements concluded by the Obama administration as basically awful agreements, and he withdrew from the process of engaging in that. I think that the United States needs to try to develop international economic law along the lines that supports a largely market-based world economy, and therefore needs to build up its market-based ties with Asia Pacific. So I think that will be the fundamental regional response. The United States very much perceives, I believe, most American foreign policymakers perceive the RCEP as a Chinese-led initiative to try to write the rules of international economic law, certainly within Asia Pacific, and the United States has, for example, will want to have a robust international law that constrains the rules of state trading enterprises, of state enterprises more broadly, and of subsidization, which the RCEP does not in any way address. The United States will also want trade agreements to address issues such as the environment more completely than RCEP. So one reaction will be, I think, the US joining the TPP, though, with changes that beef up, strengthen the provisions in the TPP on environment, on state enterprises, on government subsidization. I think also we will respond we are already responding with a trilateral conversation, cooperating with Japan and with Brussels, with the European Union, on building understanding on those same issues, state enterprises and subsidization and the environment, that we will try to expand to include other countries.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our next question. Do you think that the US position on China's alleged persecution of the Uyghur community would be more assertive?
That it will be more assertive. Well, it's already been more assertive. The Biden administration announced additional sanctions on Chinese authorities who are engaged in the persecution of the Uyghurs, which I understand the very diplomatic framing of this as alleged. It's really not alleged. There's plenty of video. I mean, unless one believes that these videos are made up, in some studio in Hollywood or something, there's video, there's mountains of evidence of this persecution.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our third question. How do you visualize the US-UK trade relations in the Biden era?
I'm sorry, U.S. what trade relations?
The United States and the United Kingdom trade relations in the Biden era.
So the U.S.-UK relationship has long been referred to as a special relationship. Obviously, we were a former colony of Great Britain centuries ago, but we have very strong friendship with the United Kingdom. We have a draft free trade agreement already completed with the United Kingdom, but there are a few barriers to concluding that. The first barrier is Biden's express focus on combating the COVID problem in the United States, and the statement that he would address those before focusing on new international agreements. So that, by definition, has put the free trade agreement with the UK on the back burner. The second issue is that Biden has long been a champion of laborers, of the working class, and that includes the semi-skilled and unskilled workers that I referred to previously, who, with each free trade agreement, face more competition from foreign workers. So new free trade agreements have to be pursued from the Biden administration's perspective very, very carefully. And the priorities of the Biden administration with regard to labor, with regard to the environment, are different from those of the Trump administration, which negotiated the basic elements of the draft free trade agreement. So those will have to be further negotiated with more protections for labor and probably more protections for the environment. So that is the second sort of barrier or issue. The third issue, which I think is comparatively easy to resolve, and I'm hopeful will be resolved, is a tax imposed by the United Kingdom, the digital services tax, a unilaterally imposed tax, which is aimed at only US digital service providers, places like Google, Facebook, Amazon, where the UK has decided to unilaterally impose a tax on those companies that leads to double taxation of those companies without collaborating with the United States on how to effectively tax them. There's an ongoing conversation in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, on how to tax those companies. The United States is engaged in a good faith manner in those negotiations, which many people expect to conclude late summer or early fall. And the UK went ahead, though, along with 5 other countries, and just acted unilaterally in imposing its own tax scheme. And this has ruffled feathers in the United States and has also, therefore, interfered with, I think, US-UK trade relations. But I do think that we will overcome these issues and within the next few years probably conclude a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Professor. The fourth question comes from Dr. Rizwanul himself, the chair of the Department of Law. Do you envisage that the Biden administration may play any role in reviving the WTO appellate body as it existed before the current impasse?
Okay, so that's a very, very good question, and it's an issue that is one of deep discussion within the Biden administration. So I think there are some very serious barriers to reinvigorating WTO dispute settlement and barriers to returning it to the way it was. So let me go over some of those problems. So the first is that I'll start with what I think is the biggest problem. I think the WTO faces a constitutional crisis of a rather profound magnitude. And I want to start with the legislative function, not the judicial function, right? The WTO has not concluded any important international agreement, no new international rules on trade since its establishment in 1995. It is paralyzed by the fact that power is now far more diffused in the organization than it was before the WTO, and certainly before China became a member and rose to power. So the GATT, which preceded, of course, the WTO, was successful because it constantly negotiated successfully new rules to address new problems in global trade as they emerged, addressing issues like technical barriers to trade, intellectual property problems, trade and services, sanitary and phytosanitary issues, more rules to deal with subsidization and dumping. It has been paralyzed in the last 25 years and has legislated nothing new. And so these chasms in international law have emerged, and the appellate body attempted to fill those chasms. And not only did it attempt to fill the chasms, it attempted to do so in the context of no checks on its judicial function. So courts succeed in branch comes in, the political branch comes in and corrects it. With no functioning political branch, with no functioning legislative capacity in the WTO, there was no check on the appellate body, and it ran rampant. It was really activist court. And in its activism leaned sort of, again, I talked about this balance before between free trade on one hand, the ideal of liberalization and liberalism on one hand, and protecting a domestic social order, which these norms of protecting other interests other than wide open trade were embedded in the GATT, right? Whether it's a national security exception, exception for protection of the environment, an exception for combating foreign subsidization, et cetera, right? Well, the appellate body really threw off that balance. Its interpretations were consistently liberalizing and consistently narrowed the scope of the exceptions and so it threw off that balance. Without a competent legislative function, restoring the appellate body and enabling it to behave in an activist fashion is seen by the United States as deeply, deeply problematic. Moreover, there's a more simple technical problem with restarting the appellate body, which is, again, goes back to the fact that there are these chasms in law. So let me go back to an example I gave earlier, Chinese state-led cyber theft of trade secrets from American firms. So there's no WTO law against that. So how should the United States respond to that, right? Well, we really only have two options. We can roll over and play dead and enable, just say, okay, well, China, you can continue to do this and and oh yes, let's continue to negotiate and see if you'll agree to a rule constraining you, which of course they won't, right? Or we can impose trade sanctions as retaliation, right? I mean, the only kinds of sanctions we can do are economic or military. We're not going to go into a shooting war over this, right? So if we impose economic sanctions, China takes us to the WTO and says, you are violating Article 2, the schedule of concessions, you're raising your tariffs above the bound rate, and we have no affirmative defense because what they're doing is legal. As long as those chasms aren't filled, reinvigorating the WTO dispute settlement mechanism puts the United States in a position of either rolling over and playing dead in response to things like neo-mercantilism by state enterprises, or neo-mercantilism through subsidization, or neo-mercantilism through theft of intellectual property, either rolling over and playing dead, or behaving in a fashion with respect to China that violates the existing rules. And we can't negotiate new rules. So it's a catch-20, what we call a catch-22, right? And so I think we have, for those reasons, it would be very difficult for the US to allow a restart of a judicialized binding dispute settlement system at the WTO.
Thank you very much, Professor. This question comes from a student of ours. And it's actually a very interesting question from Raj Vishal. What do you have to say about the foreign relations that will be changing with North Korea?
Certainly, the United States will not will not continue to, I think, appease North Korea in the way that Trump did, and certainly President Biden will not fawn all over Kim Jong-un and refer to him as his close friend. And I don't think he'll even be shaking Kim Jong-un's hand anytime ever. So I don't think that the relations will fundamentally improve. I do think that there are risks entailed. North Korea plays something of a game of brinksmanship, and that is a very dangerous game to play. There is a risk of stumbling into a military conflict, even accidentally. One could imagine things like North Korea launching an unarmed intermediate range missile over Guam, which is the United States territory. The United States not knowing whether that missile is armed or not, some sort of accidental response. There are all sorts of risks of accidental response, I think. So there are risks entailed. I think that China has the capacity to put enormous pressure on North Korea to cooperate and resolve all sorts of issues between the United States and North Korea, and between South Korea and North Korea. And China, I believe, finds it in its interest tension with the United States, between China and the United States increases, and as China becomes more assertive in its revisionist approach to international affairs, for China's perspective, it's good to have North Korea as an irritant, and to have plausible deniability that it has any control over North Korea, and to allow North Korea to create at least headaches, if not direct challenges to the United States, and say, oh, well, we can't stop them. They're a sovereign independent state, when of course it has great sway over them, much in the way that China, I think, has great sway over Myanmar, and could, if it wanted to, effectively pressure Myanmar to allow back the Rohingya refugees in a humane way. But of course, China doesn't have any interest in doing that. China doesn't care. China is not a country which has shown great concern for human rights, international criminal law, or humanitarian matters, so it doesn't really care about the Rohingyas' problems or Bangladesh's problems in that regard, right? It does care about military access or naval access to the Bay of Bengal through Myanmar, and so I don't, it has considerable leverage with many states, including North Korea, and it's in its interest now not to, or at least only loosely constrain North Korea. So I think our relations with North Korea will continue to be cool, and certainly cooler than in the Trump administration.
Thank you very much, Professor. Another question. Assuming that the ICJ issues a judgment against Myanmar, what kind of a role do you think the Biden administration may have in pressurizing Myanmar authorities in complying with the judgment?
So, first off, it's fairly rare that the United States uses sanctions or material leverage to pressure other countries to comply with ICJ decisions. The United States will use moral arguments and will certainly argue that that states should comply with ICJ decisions, but actually taking action that is material is, I think, unlikely in that case as well. We will certainly support the ICJ decision. I would think we would support it, assuming it finds Myanmar in contravention of international obligations, which I can't imagine it will not find Myanmar in contravention. But I think actual, again, material actions against Myanmar, there's little more we can do. I mean, we're sanctioning the government fully at this point. We don't have the leverage just by virtue of geography, right? We don't have the leverage over Myanmar that China does. And as I said, I think that China holds the cards here, not the United States. And I don't think China cares.
Thank you very much, sir. Although we do have a lot of questions, but then again, due to time constraints, we're not being able to ask all of them. This is the last question, sir. Although you only briefly alluded to this, what kind of role that you see for the US assuming in the Middle East?
So I think there will be a lot of continuity in our role in the Middle East with the past administration in the following sense. The structural context of the Middle East did not change with the incoming Biden administration. There is a balance of power between very, very broadly Sunni states and Shia-oriented states, right? Between the west side of the Persian Gulf and the east side of the Persian Gulf. And the United States clearly is an ally and has military bases in the Sunni countries on the west side of the Persian Gulf. So that isn't going to fundamentally change. With regard to Israel, I think there will be there will be a subtle change in that this administration is fiercely opposed to settlements by the Israelis in the occupied territories. The United States continues to strongly favor the establishment of a Palestinian state. At the same time, Israel is perceived as an ally, certainly an ally, again, of those predominantly Sunni states on the western side of the Gulf. Israel is an ally of those states de facto, and we are part of that alliance. Israel is also perceived as the only true democracy in the Middle East. I believe that is a questionable statement, only because Palestinians do not have full rights of contestation or participation in the system, and therefore it is a democracy, but it is a limited democracy. But for those reasons, we will continue to be allied with Israel, and that fundamental balance of power is unchanged. So our policies will be fundamentally unchanged, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. We are at the end of the program. We have had a lot more questions, but due to time constraints, we are not being able to ask them to you. I do personally thank you on behalf of the Department of Law for delivering this lecture, and I am quite certain that every one of us thoroughly enjoyed it. Provided that you've missed any part of Professor Richard's lecture, please do not worry about it, because we will have it uploaded on our YouTube channel very soon. Professor Richard, if there's anything you'd like to say to the audience.
Yes, first, thank you for excellent questions, and thank you all, and in particular, you, Saquib, and Professor Rizwan for this opportunity. I've quite enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good night, everyone. Good night, sir.